Okay, Devinder ji, Rohit, thank you so much. Namaste and welcome.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Yes, really nice to be with both of you, Devinder ji and Rohit. Your introductions will be something that we'll add into our descriptions as well. And I'm sure people know of you and your work also. But just looking forward to this chat, Devinder ji, about various topics around food, agriculture, and you most importantly. So you have been an inspiration to many of us. Many of us have heard your talks and like suddenly reconsidered our views very deeply. I don't know how long I heard you, but the first time I heard you, I was like, whoa, I was quite blown away by what you had shared. It was at Bhumi many years ago, and yeah, I was quite blown away. And I was curious about. I was like, how? I'm just going to be candid about where I was. I was like, whoa, this is like somebody who knows these things so articulately and at the back of his hand, and like, yeah, it's quite an impact that had happened. So I was curious about your story in fact. When did this work begin for you? How were you as a young person? What did you do then that let you become like this today? And what were the key points in your life where you got inspired? So that would be a great place to start.
Wow. I think this is something that one is not normally used to do, talking about himself or the journey ahead or the journey so far. But I guess, it is time to reflect and go back to see where and how one began, And I think if I am remembering correctly, I think I was a student of agriculture at the Himachal Pradesh Agriculture University, what is called as CSK, University for Agriculture Sciences at Palampur in Himachal Pradesh. And after I finished my master's in plant breeding and genetics, I had always had a flair for writing. And I used to write, I used to contribute at that particular time when I was a student. And that was a period which actually, or let's say, the kind of training that one, I would use the word training, quote unquote, that one was utilizing that particular time as a student to write for various magazines and newspapers. It came in handy to be the agriculture correspondent of Indian Express. Now, that was the job that I was, of course, very keenly looking forward to. But interestingly, this was also a unique position because the newspaper thought that the agriculture correspondent should not be based in New Delhi and should not be shuttling between the Ministry for Agriculture and the office. And they wanted to have an agriculture correspondent who should be traveling in the country and doing special reports from various regions and whatever I thought was important. I think this was a unique concept in journalism. And the great doyen of Indian journalism, S. Mulgaonkar, was the one who had interviewed me and thought that this is a role that Indian Express should be introducing in the country, a role in the sense that this kind of journalism. So I think it was very fascinating, I must say, because not many of my colleagues understood my role. I was posted at Chandigarh because agriculturally that's the most advanced region of the country, but not meant for the Chandigarh edition of Indian Express. So it took some time for my bosses to understand my role. And, and of course, then there was no looking back. But I think what was more important was that in the next 10 years, I traveled extensively, all paid by my newspaper, which means the newspaper invested on me to travel across the country and to report, to come out with my analytical pieces. Just to illustrate, give you an example of what I'm trying to say. Dryland agriculture is a very important area or an aspect of Indian agriculture that we all are talking about it. And I remember my editors calling me up and saying that we need to do a series of reports on dryland agriculture. Now, if I was to do, let's say if I was a modern journalist and I was to do a report today, it will take me a couple of hours. You pick up a quote from here and there, pick up the information, speak to a few people in power or in various institutions and so on, and your report is ready. But not many people would believe me when I would tell them that I traveled for 3 months in the dryland regions of India, visiting various institutes, talking to scientists, meeting farmers, and visiting those areas where, of course, one always wanted to go and understand. And in this process of travel for 3 months, when I was ready, I went to my nearest place because Indian Express was a multi-edition newspaper at that particular time, even now. And so I filed my reports, a series of 3 reports, which were carried by all the editions of the Indian Express. And but the point I want to deliver here is that those 3 months were actually my learning. Normally what you study in the university or in the colleges, you think you know it all, but I think my learning happened by way of such extensive travels within the country. And I'm sure you will all agree that a degree is okay, but I think getting across to the country, getting across to understand what the feelings, aspirations, hopes, and so on is what is crucial. And also you get to know the ground realities, and then of course you form your opinion. Now, I think these 10 years were, as I said earlier, essentially my learning. And this period actually is the foundation of what I'm able to do today. Because once you have that, a grip over the ground realities of the country, then I think your understanding widely deviates from what has been taught in the university or in the colleges. And I think I'm sure you'll agree that not many people would get that opportunity. I was very lucky to be at the right place at the right time, because normally what happens is you can be a journalist, a good journalist, and a very prominent one, but the fact is you are far away or cut away from the realities of the country, A. And B is, even if you're an academician, you would normally get a chance to go for conferences or meetings, but normally you spend more time looking into your computer terminals or researching. And so which means basically you are trying to pick up on what research has been done by other people, which is okay. I'm not saying that that's not done. But I think the best learning could perhaps have happened, or could perhaps happen, if you are able to travel extensively. Now, these years were the formative years for the kind of understanding that one could come up with. And I think this is something which of course should be reflected, or we must be reflective in the kind of writings or talks, or or all the kinds of events that one is involved with in the country. I think that is how it began. But I think what is more important is to know or to appreciate the importance of or the very significance of learning by traveling. I think traveling is the best education that one can hope for. Now, after this was done, at a stage, then one feels when you have been at various levels in journalism, and then you realize that somebody has to be speaking on behalf of these people who are, or the millions who are actually voiceless. And at some stage in my career, I decided to leave everything, to get out of the normal rigmarole, and try or aim to speak for those whose voice is never heard, and which meant it was a very, very tough decision. I'm sure you'll agree, because speaking reality is not something that is highly appreciated, and you have to be ensuring that you are politically incorrect, or if you are politically incorrect, you are in trouble. But you must, that's how the normal tendency is, to be politically correct as far as possible. And but in this particular case, I thought the task that one has cut out for himself was more important than working or worrying about whether one is politically correct or not, or one is defining or going by the narrative that has been laid out before you and so on. But I thought it was something important to stand up and speak the truth, and it comes at in various forms and in various ways. And I think this is what one has been over the decades, trying to reach out to people, to actually connecting one part of the world with another part of the world. I think that's a task that I had taken on myself.
Hello, Devinder ji. Absolute pleasure to be speaking to you again after all these years. When I started, one of the reasons I started my work was, one of the lectures that you gave at an institute. Devinder ji, just wanted to understand, you've seen a whole lot in your journey over the last few decades. From when you started over to now, where do you see India placed? Do you think there is a greater likelihood in reviving our agriculture and food systems compared to decades ago? Or are we still on a downward slope and you foresee things getting worse off?
Well, I think the time that I was talking about, Rohit, was a time when agriculture was in dire straits. And we know the kind of crisis that existed at that time, because, what is happening today, especially the farm movement that the country is witnessing, is actually the outcome, or what I always say, it is the compound anger that has built over the last few decades. And farming and farmers have been left aside in the path to that growth that we talk about. And the farmers have been, in a way, the understanding is that agriculture has to be sacrificed for the sake of economic reforms. And that's the kind of a, mainline economic thinking that is global and also national. We are part of it. And somehow this belief is what has exacerbated the crisis in agriculture. When I say this belief, means the kind of policies that we draw based on that kind of assumption is what has led to the agrarian crisis, not only in India, but across the world. I think that's something which is very strange to see that, after so many years, we find whether it is the crisis or the agrarian crisis in America or the agrarian crisis in India, the scale may be different. But if you see the bottom line is the same, or the kind of design which brought in is the same today. And when I look at both, within India and also outside India, I realize that unless, the younger people, especially people like you, and your colleague, if we are able to understand or to, basically look into how the economic design actually is what has led to the crisis. Unless you understand, unless you are able to grapple with that, I don't think you will ever understand, or anyone will understand, why is the farmer suffering despite putting in so much of hard work, month after month and year after year, and yet you find them committing suicide or selling off their body organs, or abandoning agriculture and migrating into the city for a menial job. All this is because of the inherent design that we have built up, which actually pauperizes agriculture, which actually has kept agriculture impoverished, and as I said earlier, this is a global phenomena. It's not only confined to India. We only happen to be borrowing that global design. So your basic question as to, over the last few decades that one has been looking at agriculture, whether things have improved or whether, which way the wind is blown all these years, I think let's be very clear. The crisis actually has worsened. It has deepened, both as far as sustainability is concerned and economic viability is concerned. On both the fronts, the world has paid enough. And I think it is time to understand that if we really want to revitalize, as you rightly asked, agriculture, or if you really want to also get out of this trap of climatic aberrations, I think the solution would perhaps be in agriculture or reforming agriculture. And when I say reforming agriculture, I'm not using that word reform in the sense the economists use it, which means privatizing. Privatization is not the way forward, in this particular case. And I think it is time to understand that agriculture needs a different focus. Agriculture needs a different, a design laid out, which can pull out these millions of people out of the distress they live in. So it is designed. The point I'm trying to make, it is that all these things may look as if the farmer is an inefficient, substandard, or is backward, is not able to take on technology and so on. But the fact of the matter is the design is so deep and so overwhelming that the poor farmer has little choice but to survive somehow in in this economic chaos, I think, which the farmers have been pushed over the years into. So the point I'm trying to make is that this also perhaps happened because the more I was getting into agriculture, the more I understood that you cannot keep your eyes only on what kind of technology the farmers are using and the weather phenomena related to it and the market prices, and you think that agriculture is the story ends here. But no, I think the story goes much beyond that, and in fact, gets into what, or perhaps people wouldn't perhaps not appreciate or understand that even the decision taken at the G7 or G20 level have a bearing on agriculture. Somehow we have not understood it as clearly as I'm trying to say. And I think the effort here has been to link up the two, to tell you or to explain to you how, a decision taken by the G7 group of countries or the leadership is actually going to further add to the crisis that the farm sector has been looking at. And that is perhaps the reason why even in America, Australia, Canada, or European Union, the so-called advanced countries, and of course the rich and developed countries, agriculture is in a severe crisis, and that's happening in countries where we have technology, where we have the money, where we have the markets operating. Then why is it that the farmers continue to suffer in that part of the world? And not only for the last 5 years, 6 years, 10 years, 20 years, but for the century, over the centuries, farmers in those part of the world, those parts of the world are suffering. And that kind of a suffering is now coming closer to our shores. It was there, but all I'm trying to say is by bringing that kind of economic design much more, I would say, deeper and in a sharper way, perhaps we would be pushing our agriculture in the same direction.
Thank you, Devinder ji. So I had a question which was a little bit of a coffee with current style question, but based on what you had said, which was saying that suppose you had a chance to spend maybe a day or either with the ministry, so with the ministers, or with the markets, which is the corporations and suppliers and everybody else, excluding farmers, or with media. Assuming that whatever you write or speak is followed by thousands of consumers who change their habits and so on. So I'm curious where the leverage is. Is it at the policy level? Is it at the corporations level, or is it at the consumer level? If you want to work on this suffering, where do you feel? What would you choose to attend?
Well, I think you yourself perhaps have pointed to that, and which is that whatever the change that you are expecting or you want to bring about, whether you involve A, B, C sectors in that, I think would actually come about from primarily the policy design. As remember, one of our philosophers had said, give me a pole long enough to lift the world and I will lift the world. And I'm sure if I had that pole with me, I could have also lifted the world out of this kind of a huge crisis that the world is witnessing, and also the kind of environmental impacts it has left behind for the planet to survive on. I think it will be very difficult, the way we see climate change happening. And the way we see is the devastation of natural resources, the rising of the oceans, the glaciers melting, the environment becomes so devastating for insects to survive, and so on and so forth. We all know that. Now, the point I'm trying to make is it all rests there. The answers to all that, the kind of a severity of the crisis that the world is witnessing today, the answers would lie with that. The pivot, which is the policy making. And if policymakers could reform themselves, or policymakers could see the realities and redesign the model that they are actually borrowing now from the Western countries, I think there is a future, and the world would be the entire world would be looking up to that kind of a role being played, or that kind of a model being created. Now, the question whether is it possible? Well, in my understanding, yes, it is definitely possible, and it is possible to reform the kind of devastation that agriculture is in. Reform in the sense that you are able to take out farmers and farming from that devastating phase that it has been pushed into all these years. Yes, it is definitely possible, Abhishek, and I am very clear that if we have one good policy maker in the country, of course it has to be the top person, the things can begin to change. I want to give you two examples here. Once I asked Professor M.S. Swaminathan, you all know him, one of our, very well-known scientist, administrator, and also called as the father of India's Green Revolution. Once I'd asked him as to, how could the political will be created, or was created, which actually brought in the green revolution in India? I'm sure you'll agree, if the bureaucrats and agriculture scientists had talked about it and continued to talk about it, the files in the ministry would have moved at a very snail's pace, and I'm sure agriculture scientists would have had continued with the kind of a debate. But there must be a political will created, which actually brought in the green revolution in India. And he, said, you are very right. And he narrated a story, which I think the people need to know. And he said that there was a time when Mrs. Indira Gandhi was the Prime Minister, and Swaminathan was the director of the Indian Agriculture Research Institute in New Delhi at Pusa. And he says he had gone to bring Mrs. Gandhi to inaugurate one of those buildings in Pusa. And in that car journey, which must be half an hour or 45 minutes, given the less traffic at that particular time, I'm sure you will all agree. In those 45 minutes, he said the entire history of Green Revolution was written or was cast. I asked him how. And he said, in that car journey, Mrs. Gandhi asked Swaminathan, and she was very fond of Swaminathan and used to call him Swami. And she said, Swami, I would go by the technology that you are trying to, tell me or suggest to me, which was the Green Revolution technology, which means the dwarf wheat varieties to be imported from Mexico, as Norman Borlaug was trying to advocate. And so Mrs. Gandhi said, yes, I will go by what you are suggesting. But can you promise or can you commit to give me a surplus of 10 to 12 million tons in a couple of years from now? And Swami said that sitting next to the Prime Minister, he said, I'm sure, Madam Prime Minister, we would be able to do that. And rest is history. Once Mrs. Gandhi got convinced that she would have 10 to 12 million tons of surplus wheat in the years to come, which would mean that India, she was looking ahead and seeing that India needed to be pushed out of or pulled out of the ship-to-mouth existence that India was reeling under or was existing under at that particular time. And I remember one sentence that I've never forgotten, which Swaminathan, I'm just quoting him verbatim. He said, when Mrs. Gandhi said that, can you give me a commitment to give me 10 to 12 million tons surplus, 10 to 12 billion tons, because I want the bloody Americans off my back. Because, I'm sure we would all agree that the prime minister at that time must have faced the humiliation, must have faced all the kinds of arm twisting that any country or a hungry country has to withstand at this particular juncture, or at that particular juncture, when you have millions of hungry people in the country and you need food. Now, that was one situation which tells us that once the top person decides that this is the way things have to move, everything falls in line. The other incident is I asked Varghese Kurian, the milkman of India. I remember a few months before I asked this question to Swaminathan, and I had asked Kurian that if he could tell me how did that political will arrive at, which brought in that cooperative milk, dairy milk structure in India. And he said he at that time when the European Union was trying to give us butter oil, free of cost and so on, he knew what will it lead to. And once he was convinced that cooperative is the way out, he of course knew that this decision could be taken by the Prime Minister at that particular time. And the Prime Minister at that particular time was Lal Bahadur Shastri. Let's be very clear, White Revolution began a few months earlier than the Green Revolution. And when Lal Bahadur Shastri was the Prime Minister, Varghese Kurian had impressed upon the Prime Minister to come and inaugurate the dairy cooperative in Gujarat, which was far away. The place where he got this inauguration done was quite far away from Ahmedabad. And the Prime Minister agreed. And when he came to Ahmedabad, at that time, they wouldn't be traveling so frequently in helicopters and so on. So, he had to come and stay in the village at night because in the next morning, the event had to be inaugurated. The first cooperative that Kurian was trying to, bring before the country. And what Kurian did was he knew that how important this particular chance or the opportunity he got. What he did was, according to what he told me, he said that he told one of those families, every village has a family which is much better to do or well to do compared to the others, and told them that you're going to have a VIP visitor tonight, and so please make arrangements. Can you make arrangements to give him a comfortable stay? And of course, that person must have agreed that he would be delighted. And so I think he was also surprised when the evening he found the Prime Minister being the VIP visitor that he was told. And when the Prime Minister came, I'm sure we will all, and I think this is what Kurian had anticipated. In the evening, the farmers of that particular village got across to the Prime Minister. They went on talking, chatting at night, and this went on till midnight. And in the morning, when Kurian was, had gone to see or invite the Prime Minister to come to inaugurate that event, the Prime Minister told him that, look, in the evening when I was having discussion with the farmers, I get convinced now that, cooperative is only the way out for the dairy sector. And so that is what Kurian had planned. And he said, yes, Mr. Prime Minister, and now you know it, and that's why we are launching this, and we can do it in a bigger scale, but provided the cooperatives operate minus the politicians and minus the bureaucracy and so on. And rest is history. We all know that Amul Dairy or the National Dairy Development Corporation was one institution, one cooperative institution where politicians and bureaucrats were kept away. And I think the professionals took over, the farmers took over. And of course, no wonder why Kurian was called as the milkman of India. So the point I'm trying to make is, if the top guy or the top person or the head of the state, can take that kind of initiative, things begin to fall. So, rest is, of course, as we all seen, it's a matter of, how you design it or how you deliver and so on and so forth. But I think what is more important is that one person who needs to be clear as to where he's going to lead the country. I think that says it all. So these two stories would tell you why I'm hopeful that someday some leader, political leader, or some head of the state, can be anywhere, but if in a country like India decides to or to take that plunge, I'm sure we can create a model, a kind of a both sustainable as well as economically viable model for the rest of the world, not only to stare at, but also to follow. And I think that is something I am sure one day it will happen.
Lovely. I had a quick follow-up question. I know Rohit has a question, but I'm going to just sneak in this quick one, which was, Devinderji, so what is the politics that will deliver the policy? In the sense, in today's day and age now, what kind of politics and I'm asking also from a middle class perspective, from myself, urban middle class, but in general also, what kind of politics would increase the chances of such a policy happening?
I think eventually it will boil down to people's voice. If more and more people begin to stand up and ask the right kind of questions, I think that has a tremendous impact on the policies and also on the politics that we all know plays a very important role, because as we have heard it again and again, that the buck stops at the political level. And so I think the politics in this particular case does not mean only the political parties, but I think would mean the kind of change that the society is yearning for, or the kind of change that is required. If you have to see that this planet, remains, a place where people can still stay. I think that politics has to evolve from the people. And if people begin to ask the right kind of questions, if people have that ability to understand the nuances, have the ability to understand the projections, or can project to which side or which direction the world is moving now, and how do we need to resurrect whatever has been lost. I think once we start looking at or grapple with these kinds of issues which are at the heart of the crisis that the world is faced with, I am sure that this will have a kind of impact, a kind of a domino impact will build up, and eventually the politics will revolve around it, because politics, of course, can remain cut off from the people. But for how long? Eventually, if the people decide that they have to stand up and ask the right kind of a question, I think, or right kind of, give a, or let's say even stand up and point to what the world should be looking forward to. Gradually 1 + 1, as we all know, becomes 11, and I think this will lead us to where it can redefine the politics that we have today. Also, let us not forget Nelson Mandela at one time had said that the biggest tragedy of 21st century is that we have lost our anger. Now, you'll ask me, what does a death sentence to do with the kind of the deeper question that you have asked? What kind of politics? Well, I think the answer is hidden there. Because what Nelson Mandela had said is that when I say anger, I don't mean you go and plant a bomb. I don't mean that you throw stones at glass windows and break the glass panes and so on. What he said, anger is your ability to understand, to comprehend, to be receptive, to digest, and then articulate it in a manner that it brings out what the you as an individual, what you as a citizen feel. And that anger is what over the last few years has disappeared, and that, I'm sure you will agree, is the kind of anger, or is the kind of treatment that we should be expecting people to get into. But the reality is that over this, as Mandela was right, the biggest tragedy of 21st century is that we have lost our anger, which means we have lost the ability to even question. And no wonder, in the kind of authoritarian, dominance that we see across the world today, even journalists have stopped asking questions. So we need to revive that spirit of standing up, comprehending it rightly, digesting it, and then, of course, articulating the voice in a manner that it changes or it has an impact on the politics that prevails. So I guess that's a role which everyone, including you, me, or the listeners, or people who are watching this, should take on themselves. That many people ask, what can I do? Well, this is what you should be doing. This is what you should be aspiring to do. Stand up and ask a question. And if you can't do it, I think it is time you stop asking that question as to what I can do so that you earn the brownie points. No, I think the real brownie point would be if you can ask the question, which means wherever you are, in whatever capacity. It's not that you have to be a journalist only to ask a question. I think today the opportunity has expanded with the social media in your hand. We can go on saying that the mainline media is not listening to us, and which is what leads to the kind of politics that we have. But the fact of the matter is, you don't have to, now look towards that mainline media. You have media right in your hand. The Android mobile phone is in your hand. Instead of just watching the videos, or looking into good morning and good night messages, I think it is important if each one of us tries to play that role of informing the other one of what his or her role has to be, and to remind him or her that your anger has disappeared and it is time to rebuild your anger. I think that is the way forward, and that's the politics that I would be looking forward to.
Devinderji, one thing I've always wanted to ask you is which themes do you take on working? I mean, there is just so much work to be done on so many themes, and just food and agriculture. For instance, when you worked on BT brinjal 15 years ago, or when you started working on farmer incomes 10 years ago. I mean, one thing I see with a lot of youngsters, they almost get overweight with the amount of things that are to be done, the amount of things that are going wrong. What would you advise to the youngsters as well? So so both fronts. How do you decide, and what would your advice be?
Well, I think first of all, the first part of your question is how does one decide? I think the way I decide is a kind of a process that I would say is an organic process that has evolved over the period. One began looking at agriculture the way normally youngsters would do, or even the policymakers do, is to look into nitrogen, phosphorus, potash, NPK. Agriculture scientists would always talk about NPK, and then of course the micronutrients and so on and so forth. Which means basically you were looking at the farming systems, the intensive model of agriculture. And then you begin to see the environmental impacts, the second generation environmental impacts appearing and so on. And then at some stage you began to see the distress building up and the farmer suicides happening or had started off and at that particular time. And gradually you see a kind of if I'm correct in saying, a kind of a systematic approach which leads us to the kinds of agrarian crisis that has built up. It has been step by step. And one has kept pace with that. I think that is important. You keep pace with what is happening. And then when you start, as I said earlier, because traveling was my learning, and once you start traveling in the country and once your eyes open up, your vistas open up, and then you realize, oh my God, what I was taught in the university was not the reality, or what I was told by the newspapers in a news report is not what is the reality. What I'm seeing here is actually the reality. And then you try to club that, you try to see that what you see, the realities that you are encountered with or faced with, and then you try to put that vis-a-vis or, looking into the kind of, the research domain or the kind of a narrative that policymakers have laid out. And then you realize that, oh my God, no, this was not what is expected. And what is needed is what these poor people who may not have a voice, but they know what is the right way to do it. Now, that was as far as farming systems and so on. Now, of course, as we know, in September, we're going to have a United Nations conference on the food systems. I think something that should have happened at least 30 years back, but it has taken them 30 years to realize the importance of food systems, which means moving away from the intensive farming system to now realizing the damage it has done to not only the environment or the ecology, but also to the society at large. So I think this has been a gradual. The point I'm trying to make is you learn. And it's a kind of a evolution that takes place in a natural way. So the horizon keeps on expanding. At one stage, when I started looking at or started comparing the implications of the international policies, this actually happened because at the time, if you remember, in the 90s, there was a debate on the World Trade Organization, the trade paradigm, and so on and so forth. And since we were active in those areas, obviously it flowed in naturally. Once you start understanding the implications of WTO parameters, and then you try to see what will it do to farmers in India or farmers in the developing countries, I think your horizon still grows further. And as I said earlier, the design becomes a little clearer to you. The economic design is, I think, also I also started, being clear about what the layout was before us, and which means agriculture was getting into the hands of a handful of companies or big players, and the smaller players or smaller farmers were being driven out of agriculture. And that's what the economic thinking is. Let's not forget, Rohit, that we have always been told that if you have larger population in agriculture, there cannot be an economic growth. And which means you have to move people out of agriculture into the urban areas, because urban areas need cheap labor. Now, where will the cheap labor come from is agriculture. So look at the design. It has been laid before us. Push people out of agriculture into the urban areas because they need cheap labor, which means to keep economic reforms viable, you need that dihadi mazdoor or cheaper labor. Okay. And which also means that you have to keep food inflation low. So the design is so that you are actually keeping agriculture deliberately impoverished to see that the reforms are viable. And even some of the big economists or the well-known economists of the world are in that track, and they continue to push those policies towards us. But I have seen, Rohit, over the years, that the kind of economic policies that are being pushed onto us, or perhaps we are borrowing it from the Western countries, are actually the policies that have failed in the Western countries. But we fail to see it is primarily because our textbooks still continue to tell us that that's the way forward. Let me illustrate, give you one example. We believe markets are the best judge. Let's leave agriculture to markets, and markets have that ability to go for price discovery, which means the farmer would get a better price for his crop. So we believe in that. Now, believe me, if that was true, please tell me, markets have been in operation in agriculture in America for several decades now. When in 1970, when Richard Nixon was the president of America in those early 70s, his agriculture secretary had made that infamous statement saying, "Get big or get out." That is what actually has reframed the American agriculture policy. And if we were to really trace what the devastation markets have done to American agriculture, I think we'll have to go back to that particular era. And what has happened is the smaller farmers moved out, the bigger players came in. And then we were told that, the lesser the population in agriculture, the higher would be their income. But no, it hasn't happened. It hasn't happened in America. It hasn't happened in Europe. It hasn't happened in Canada. In America, the population in agriculture today is only 1.5%. So which means the American farmer should be a prosperous farmer, whose agriculture should be giving him a higher income. I'm sure you will agree. But look at America. Look at America today. Every 5 years, America pumps in massive subsidies under what it calls as the Farm Bill that it brings in after every 5 years. Massive agriculture subsidies. 2018 Farm Bill, had provided a subsidy support of about $867 billion for the next 10 years. And yet, American agriculture is in a serious crisis. American farmers are committing suicide. According to a study in America, the rate of suicide in rural America is 45% higher than urban America. In fact, there in America, the median income, if you leave aside 2020, because that was the election year, but the median income prior to that since 2013 has been in the negative. And American farmers are being sustained by pumping in of massive subsidy. Average subsidy support that American farmers gets every year is $62,000. So it is these kinds of subsidy supports which is actually adding on to farmers' income, if at all you can call it a viable farmers' income for which means that the markets themselves had not been able to provide farmers with a livable income or with a viable income. and it is the subsidy support which is actually adding on to that kind of income that we in India believe that the farmers would be getting once we leave them to markets. It didn't happen in Canada. It didn't happen in European Union, as I said earlier. The other argument that I see here is also, and this is, I think, this is your question. I think if I'm answering it correctly, this is how it has evolved. The entire journey, I think, has evolved to this level that you begin to then, understand that how is this the livelihood of a small farmers, given the economic concept or the economic theories. You try to place that in that concept, and you find that the theories have flopped. The theories have collapsed. But we are boring on, or we are, going ahead with the same kind of economic theories which haven't succeeded. So I think it is time to discard that economic thinking and come up with a fresh economic thinking. That's what the world urgently requires. And I think that is where we even when you are in a developing country or so on, or in whatever position we are, I'm sure the younger people, much younger than me, would be able to try to grapple with this kind of issue, understand it, and then perhaps show a pathway that could lead to that kind of a correction that is required in the economic arena. I think that is very important, Rohit. And why I'm saying is this, that this again, one of the, sorry, I'm adding on here another economic theory that is very prevalent, that a small farmer in India, as we know, 86% farmers have land holding size less than 2 hectares or 5 acres. So this is not viable, we are told. Okay, so we need FPOs, we need other systems to aggregate these land holdings, so that we can have a bargaining power. That is the argument you have heard again and again. And but if that is if that is so, I think what we have not been able to see is that in America the average land holding size is 444 acres. In India, it is 5 acres. So if 444 acres in India, if we club all the, some of these land holdings, or let's say we reach the level of 400 acres, or let's say even if we reach a level of 4,000 acres, we believe they will have bargaining power. But in America, if 10 farmers could have got together, they would have had a bigger bargaining power. But did it happen? The answer is no. If you look at Canada, the average land holding size in Canada is 3,000 acres. So did that, bigger farm size or the scale help in getting them a higher price? The answer is no. Look at Australia. In Australia, the average land holding size is 4,000 and roughly about 200 hectares, which means about 1,200 acres, roughly around that is the average land holding size, which means the Australian farmers should actually be dictating the markets. I'm sure you'll agree with that kind of a large land holding, they should be dictating the markets. But no, Australian farmers are also in severe crisis. In the last 30 years, 25% of the farms have closed down in Australia. The point I'm trying to make is that this economic thinking that, the larger the size, the more the viable farm would be. It hasn't happened in America. It hasn't happened in the developed countries. And I think, but somehow our policymakers still, are putting the eggs in the same basket. So is that the right way forward? I think we will discuss that in future as we go ahead. But I think what is important is to see, first of all, where things have gone wrong. And this could be at various levels, not only at the level of the science that was taught to us, or the technologies that were introduced, or the role the agribusiness played, and the corporates, and so on and so forth, but also eventually also look at the bigger economic design, as I've been repeatedly saying.
I think Rohit just froze. Just want to check if he had a follow-up question on this one. Just want to check if he's there. I think he's frozen. So there were two questions, Devinder ji. I'm going to ask Rohit's question also, because he's also frozen. I think his was much more around the futuristic directions. And you said that how do we go into the future? So I think his was more saying, how do you foresee futuristic directions? What would you say are futuristic directions? And I'll combine it with mine also, that in seeing social change happen, and you are a change maker by from many angles, you are a change maker. What have you learned about making change happen? So over your journey, if you reflect back, how does change happen? What have you learned? So those are two questions. I think one is what do you see happen, and what's a futuristic direction that you'd like to share, and how
I
does
think
change happen?
change happens when you yourself are convinced that that's the way forward. I think more important is to first convince yourself. Be sure that what you are saying is something, even people may not agree with it, or the mainline may discard you or may scoff at you and so on and so forth. But you should be confident that this is the way forward, and which means that confidence comes up with the kind of scholarship that you had brought in or you had gone into, and the kind of fellowship that you talked about, and also the kind of learning that you have been able to imbibe over the period. Now, once that gives you a confidence that no, based on what you have seen, the realities and so on, you at least know that this is the way forward. And I'm sure, don't worry about it. Even if nobody agrees with you, don't think that you haven't made the right kind of initiative or right kind of step in the right direction. Why I'm saying is, I give you the example. Let me illustrate. When the first time I said that, what farmers need is a direct income support, there were farmer leaders who first asked me, where will the money come from? I was surprised, because it is not the task that farmer leaders should have been worried about. If you look at the employees' unions, they have been coming up with the 5th pay commission report, 6th pay commission report, 7th pay commission. They go on demanding a pay rise every year or every 5 years or whatever it is. But they never raise the question, where will the money come from? That's the job for the finance minister to find out. But nevertheless, so it tells you clearly that the farmer leaders of India were so mentally tuned to this kind of a message that has percolated deep into them, that there's no money for agriculture. That's the kind of thinking they have, that no. We since the country is a bigger one, we need to help everyone, and there is no money for agriculture, so we have to survive in whatever is given to us. That kind of understanding. But when I first said that yes, agriculture needs direct income support, some economists even scoffed at me. Some even pointed at me, named me as fanciful ideas of Devinder Sharma and so on. But I guess, I was very convinced that nowhere in the world agriculture has survived without getting support. And that is something which actually made me realize that direct income support is the way forward. And given the conditions that agriculture operates in, that's the only way forward to compensate or to help or to add on to the farmers' meager income. Now, believe me, for several years, I continue to raise this point over the need for direct income support. And eventually, some of our civil society groups also understood the importance, and they also raised this particular aspect. And then I think even politicians started talking about it. And then, of course, economists also started talking about it. Interestingly, when in 2018, the government, the NDA government brought in what is called as PM Kisan Saman Nidhi scheme, which means 6,000 rupees per year to a farmer, which comes to 500 rupees per month, which is very, very low. I know that. But I had at that particular time called it as a tectonic shift. Tectonic shift because, from moving from price policy to income policy, I think was the way forward. And believe me, at that particular time, some of the economists who had, always said that Devinder Sharma doesn't understand economics, because in this stage of market economy, to transfer income from the public exchequer to the people, I think is an outlandish idea. That's what they used to say. But when it happened, when the government introduced that scheme, believe me, some of them started to say, oh, that's a master stroke. Now, it tells you clearly that their understanding is just to see what the policymakers or what the government do, and then they go into the chorus, themselves to sing pens for it. But that's okay. The point I'm trying to make is you have to be very clear, and that comes up from your own research or from your own analysis as to way forward. Now, if you look at it, the farm movement. I remember when the protests around New Delhi began. And the demand of the farming unions, if you remember, I'm sure you will also recall, in the beginning was to repeal the three farm laws, and I made a statement and I said, that what we need is a fourth law. We already have three laws. What we need is a fourth law, which makes MSP a legal right for farmers, which means no trading takes place below MSP. Now, that was a statement which brought in a lot of queries for me. People asking me, oh, you're getting away from the main demands of the farming community and so on. And also you're moving to an era or an area which is in direct conflict with the market economy and so on and so forth. But I guess it took me some time to explain to them that if we have the fourth law, or if we have a law which says that MSP becomes a legal right for farmers, the first three laws actually collapse. Because I think farmer is more interested in getting an assured price, whether a private sector pays him or whether a public sector pays him. That's his demand or his need. So, but the private sector would not be interested, because in reality, they don't pay a higher price anywhere in the world. So it's an illusion that has been created that when the markets come, farmers will get a higher price. But as I have questioned and I had raised pointers at many a platform, that please tell me where in the world have markets given farmers a higher price. Now, so I think the point I'm trying to make is that it took them some time, even the farmers, to understand that more important, along with these three laws repeal, was also to bring in a fourth law or another law which says or which makes MSP a legal right for farmers. Now, so the point I'm trying to make is you have to be first be convinced that that what you are suggesting or what you are coming up is something that you will stand for, because you feel there's no other way that you can move on to left or right or whatever you want to do. So I think this is the way you have to, as your question as to how do you get on to these kinds of things, bringing about or focusing on the future, I think stems from that kind of a clarity of thought and also the confidence that you have built up. But that clarity of thoughts comes up from the vast learning that you have passed through or you have undergone over the last few decades. And I think the other message that I would like to convey is that never be overawed by personalities. You will have many people will quote you, oh, that Nobel laureate says so, or that great economist says so. Don't be overawed by their position or their names. I think you should know that even if you are not in that category of great economists, I think you being a people's economist or you trying to raise the voice of the people, what people need, I think that is more important than worrying about what gentleman A or gentleman B or gentleman C or whichever institutes he or she comes from, whether from the IMF or the World Bank, it doesn't really matter. I think that feeling perhaps came to me because I was a journalist at one stage, and journalists are used to one-to-one, discussions and talks. And I think at least one is not enamored by the personality that you are talking to or you are interviewed. And I think that is something, perhaps it came to me naturally because of my profession. But I guess people have to also understand that please don't worry which personality has said so. If you think this is the right decision for the country to move into, or that direction for the country to move into, or for the farming community to move into, stand up and say that, articulate that. Forget about what the bigger economist or the people tell you. Why I'm saying is this, there was a time, you will be, let me take you back to that time it was in 1996. I remember at a conference at the MS Swaminathan Research Foundation in Chennai, the then Vice President Sustainable Development of the World Bank, a gentleman called Professor Ismail Sarageldin, who also was, by the virtue of his position, the chair of the Consultative Group on International Agriculture Research, which is the governing body of the International Agriculture Research Centers across the globe. And he had in his presentation said that the World Bank estimates, this was in 1996, he said that the World Bank estimates that in the next 20 years, which means 2015, the number of people who will be migrating from the rural to the urban areas in India would be equal to twice the combined population of UK, France, and Germany. The combined population of UK, France, and Germany is 200 million. So the World Bank had estimated 400 million people will migrate from the rural to the urban areas in India by the year 2015. Now, for a number of years, I thought they were alerting us, they were warning us. But then eventually I realized, no, it was a dictate. It was a dictate that India had to follow. We have to move people out of rural areas to urban areas, and that is what is the dominant economic thinking. You know that over the last few decades, and the successive governments have been trying to exhibit that kind of a movement, and so therefore we are moving in that particular direction. We are going ahead, but I think the lockdown, the first lockdown last year, should have opened our eyes. I had all these years called these 400 million people as agricultural refugees. These were the people who were being pushed out of rural areas. And just like in any war or any conflict, when the people move out, they are the refugees. And similarly, all the climate change refugees, we know it. So these were actually the agricultural refugees. And if you remember, the first 2 days after the lockdown, we saw at least, 100 million people going back intrastate and interstate to what is called as the biggest reverse migration or biggest migration that the country had witnessed after the 1947 partition. Now, that actually tells us very clearly that model of, pushing people from the rural to the urban areas needed a rethink. The urban areas had not absorbed that kind of a population shift. And so therefore, just 2 days of lockdown, they were forced to walk back. And we know, we all remember those pictures, grim pictures, a grim reminder to what had happened. But the point is, imagine if the focus of the economic design or the economic design had made a focus on building up on that population in the rural areas, instead of creating conditions where the income goes down to such a level that they move out into the urban areas. I think that's the kind of a direction that we should have moved to. So what we need is not only that reverse migration should have taught us a lesson that we need to reverse that economic thinking. Now, don't be enamored by which of these economists, great economists of the world tells you, no, we need to move people out of agriculture to the urban areas. I think what the world today needs is to make agriculture economically viable and profitable. And as the Prime Minister has said a number of times, sabka saath, sabka vikas. That can happen only if 50% of the population has more money in their hand, their profession is more viable. I'm sure it will lead to a huge demand, creation of a demand in this country. And that demand is what will lead to the economic, wheels of economic growth happening. Now, is that a model that we can't follow? But we perhaps would be forced by that dominant economic thinking to abandon that and go towards the usual GDP pathway. And I think what India needs is today to move from keeping only industry as the engine of growth. What we need actually are two engines of growth. Agriculture should be an engine of growth. We need to rebuild agriculture to become an engine of growth. And we also need industry as an engine of growth. Imagine the kind of economic growth it will derive when both these sectors, become equally powerful. And I'm sure you will agree, that kind of growth, you are only struggling with 7%, 8%, 9%. I'm sure if agriculture was to become an engine of growth, the kind of GDP would be not only, going from 8 to 10, or, it will be quadrupling, in such a manner. And that is actually built on Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas. Can't we stand up for Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas? Why do we have to just go by few Nobel laureates who have been pointing us towards that direction, or what the World Bank and IMF have been saying? Why can't we look into where India should be heading towards?
Wow, that's a lovely and hopeful direction and question, Devinder ji. And I think this conversation leaves me with a lot of hope, a lot of food to think about, and also a lot of questions that we'll sit with and come back to you perhaps for another round of this conversation. Rohit, any closing comments from you before we close?
Yeah, Devinder ji, absolute pleasure again and honor to be sitting with you virtually in that space. And I'm sure as you have continued doing for years and decades, your work will continue inspiring more and more people to take on pieces of the footprint of your work that you are leaving in various directions.
Well, thank you very much to both of you. And I must, in fact, compliment both of you for having thought over it. And I think wanting to see that how this message goes across to the younger people and who may have a lot of questions, of course. Many things will crop up from this particular conversation that we had. But I think what is important is a clarity of thought that it will eventually lead us to. And I think that is what brings about changes, And if you have to really look for a change, I think as Mahatma Gandhi had said, that it has to begin with you. And what they change that you are expecting in the others, it has to begin with you. And I think what I'm trying to share my journey or through what I have seen or what I have worked on, I think that tells us that we should not be driven by that dominant economic paradigm that has been laid before us. But I think we should always have that ability to stand up and ask a question. And I think, as I said earlier, I'm sure you will all must have been inspired by what Mandela had said once, And if we can rebuild anger in the spirit of what Mandela had mentioned or talked about, I think the world will begin to change sooner than later. And I think we need that urgency, or we need that sooner to happen faster than perhaps waiting for it for a long period. So thank you very much once again to both of you. And I really enjoyed speaking to you. Always, it's a pleasure being with you and talking to you. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Devinder.
Thank you,
Rohit.